In August of 1926, something extraordinary happened on the streets of New York City. A movie star was dying, and outside the hospital, people gathered as though they were waiting for news about someone they knew personally. Many of them were women. They stood on the sidewalk for hours, some praying, some crying, hoping that the doctors inside could save a man they had never actually met. His name was Rudolph Valentino, and at only 31 years old, he had become something Hollywood had never seen before. To millions of women, he was not simply an actor. He was romance itself. Then on August 23rd, the news came. Valentino was dead. The reaction was immediate. Grief spilled into the streets. Newspapers reported women fainting and crowds struggling to accept that the young man they had watched beneath desert moons and across smoky dance floors would never appear in another film. In the days that followed, enormous crowds descended upon the Manhattan funeral home where his body lay. Contemporary reports placed the number of people attempting to view his coffin in the tens of thousands, with some estimates reaching 100,000. Police struggled to hold back the mourners. Windows were broken in the crush. Mounted officers were brought in as lines stretched along the surrounding blocks. There were even sensational stories of women taking their own lives after hearing of his death, although some of those reports were never confirmed. But the scale of the mourning itself was real, and it raised a question that has followed Valentino for nearly a century. What did these women see in him? Hollywood had handsome men before Rudolph Valentino. It had romantic leading men, elegant men, and dangerous men. Yet somehow this young immigrant from southern Italy reached women differently. On the silent screen, he needed no voice. A glance could suggest desire. A slight change in expression could reveal tenderness or pain. He could appear commanding in one moment and strangely vulnerable in the next. Women did not merely watch him. Many felt that he was speaking directly to something they wanted, but rarely saw in the men Hollywood had offered them before. And that is where Valentino's story becomes far more complicated than the legend. Because while millions of strangers dreamed about being loved by him, the private man behind Hollywood's greatest lover did not seem nearly as fortunate in love. His marriages brought humiliation, scandal, and heartbreak. The qualities women adored in him also made him the target of ridicule from men who questioned everything from his clothes to his masculinity. And only weeks before his death, Valentino was still publicly fighting to prove what kind of man he really was. Perhaps that is why the crowds outside his coffin matter so much. They were mourning more than a handsome face. They were mourning a fantasy that had ended before anyone could discover what it might become. But long before women lined the streets to say goodbye to Rudolph Valentino, women were already helping shape his destiny. Before they paid for movie tickets to watch him dance, they paid just a few cents for the privilege of dancing with him themselves. Long before Hollywood turned Rudolph Valentino into a fantasy, he was a restless young man trying to imagine a life larger than the one waiting for him in southern Italy. He was born in Castellaneta on May 6, 1895, into a family that expected something far more practical from him than movie stardom. His father was a strict veterinarian, while his mother was remembered as the warmer, more indulgent presence in his childhood. When his father died in 1906, Valentino was only 11, and the loss seems to have deepened a restless streak already inside him. School did little to contain it. His family tried discipline, sending him away and eventually steering him toward agricultural studies. But the young man was already dreaming beyond the life others had chosen for him. Years later, he recalled imagining himself as a figure of daring and glamour, almost as though he had invented a private version of Rudolph Valentino before the world knew that name. At 17, he went to Paris, where dancing, nightlife, fashionable society, and gambling offered a glimpse of the world he wanted. It did not last. He spent his money and returned home with little to show for the adventure, except experience, and an even stronger desire to escape an ordinary future. Then in 1913, before he was 19, America offered another chance. He sailed for New York and arrived just before Christmas, carrying an agricultural education that would soon prove far less useful than his appearance, his manners, and his ability to move across a dance floor. New York was not waiting for him. The money he had brought disappeared, and according to later accounts, there were periods when he slept on park benches and washed himself wherever he could. It was a remarkable distance from the elegant movie star the world would later remember. But the city also revealed something important about him. Valentino understood how to make an impression. By 1914, he had found work as a taxi dancer at Maxim's, where customers could pay roughly 10 cents for a dance with a professional partner. Many of those customers were women, including well-to-do women looking for companionship and excitement in Manhattan nightlife. Valentino had exactly what the job required. He was young, darkly handsome, graceful, attentive, and especially skilled at the tango. He learned how to lead without seeming rough, how to move close without losing elegance, and perhaps most importantly, how to make the woman in his arms feel that, for the length of a song, she had his complete attention. Years before a silent close-up would make female moviegoers feel that he was looking directly at them, Valentino was learning that same intimacy face to face. He also gave private dance lessons and moved through social circles far removed from the hardship he had known after arriving in America. Rumors would later surround this period of his life, including suggestions that his companionship sometimes went beyond dancing, but those claims were never firmly established. What is clear is that women were already opening doors for him before Hollywood did. Yet one relationship would soon lead him through a very different door. His friendship with the married Chilean heiress Blanca de Sol drew him into a bitter divorce scandal. Valentino testified on her behalf, and in September 1916, he himself was arrested during a vice investigation. The charges were eventually dropped for lack of evidence, but the tabloids had already found their story. The handsome foreign dancer, surrounded by wealthy women and scandal. Then the story became darker still when Blanca shot and killed her former husband during a custody dispute. Valentino had seen enough. In 1917, with New York filled with memories of humiliation and gossip, the 21-year-old headed west to California. He could not have known it then, but the scandal that helped drive him out of New York was sending him toward the place that would make his face immortal. When Rudolph Valentino arrived in California in 1917, Hollywood did not see the man millions of women would soon dream about. Studios saw something more limited, a dark, foreign-looking young actor who could play villains, gangsters, dangerous outsiders, or the mysterious man lurking at the edge of someone else's story. The leading men of the era were usually expected to look unmistakably American, and Valentino's Mediterranean features placed him outside that familiar mold. He accepted small parts because he needed the work, but he wanted more. Then in 1919, his private life delivered an humiliation stranger than anything he had yet played on screen. Through Hollywood's social circles, Valentino met actress Jean Acker. Their courtship moved with remarkable speed, and in November 1919, after knowing each other only briefly, they married. What followed became one of the most famous stories attached to Valentino's romantic life. On their wedding night, Acker locked her new husband out of the room. Valentino reportedly knocked and pleaded to be allowed inside, but the door remained closed. The marriage was never consummated, and the couple never established anything resembling a normal married life. Within weeks, they were effectively separated, although the divorce would not become final until years later. Gossip naturally rushed in to explain what had happened, but much of it remains uncertain. What mattered publicly was the painful irony. The man who would soon be sold to the world as the ultimate lover had begun his first marriage standing on the wrong side of a locked door. Valentino rarely wanted to discuss the episode afterward, but Hollywood was about to open another door for him. The person who saw what the studios had missed was screenwriter June Mathis. She believed Valentino possessed something that could not be measured simply by whether he resembled the conventional American leading man. When Metro prepared its adaptation of The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, Matas pushed for Valentino to play Julio Desnoyers, an Argentine playboy whose life is transformed by war. The film premiered in 1921, and one sequence changed Valentino's future. In a crowded nightclub, Julio dances the tango with commanding ease. Valentino did not need dialogue. His body supplied the language, the controlled movements, the closeness, the confidence, and the gaze that seemed to make the dance feel more intimate than audiences were accustomed to seeing. Women noticed. The same skill that had once earned him a few cents at a time on New York dance floors was now being projected onto enormous screens before audiences across America. The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse became a major success, and suddenly the foreign appearance that had limited Valentino became part of his attraction. Later that year came the Sheikh. As Sheikh Ahmed Ben Hassan, Valentino was transformed into something larger than an actor. He became a fantasy, exotic, commanding, mysterious, and intensely romantic. Female audiences responded with an enthusiasm Hollywood had rarely seen directed toward a male performer. His photographs appeared in magazines. Women crowded his appearances. The face studios once considered too foreign for a conventional hero was becoming one of the most recognizable faces in America. The transformation had taken barely 2 years. In 1919, his own bride had refused to open a door for him. By the end of 1921, millions of women were paying to enter theaters just to watch him. But the question was no longer simply how Valentino became famous. Something about him was producing a reaction that other handsome actors did not. And strangely, the very qualities that made women want him would soon make some American men deeply uncomfortable. By 1921, Rudolph Valentino was no longer simply another handsome actor in Hollywood. Something unusual was happening whenever women watched him. There were other men with strong features, expensive clothes, and carefully photographed faces. Yet Valentino seemed to create a different kind of intimacy. Part of it came from the contradiction he carried on screen. He could look commanding without appearing emotionally distant. He could pursue a woman with confidence, then reveal uncertainty, tenderness, even hurt. In an era when male stars were often presented as straightforward figures of strength, Valentino allowed vulnerability to remain visible. That combination made him difficult to reduce to a single type. He could be forceful and gentle, masculine and graceful, mysterious and emotionally exposed, sometimes within the same scene. His eyes became part of the legend. In silent films, where there was no spoken dialogue to carry a romantic moment, a close-up mattered enormously. Valentino understood how to hold a gaze just long enough to make it feel personal. He could suggest desire without saying a word, then soften his expression until the same face seemed wounded or uncertain. For women sitting in darkened theaters, that silence left room for imagination. He was not telling them exactly what to feel. They could place their own hopes inside the spaces his performances left open. His physical movement added another layer. Years spent dancing before Hollywood had taught him how to use his body with unusual control. He did not simply walk into a room, he seemed to move through it with purpose. When he danced, especially the tango, strength and elegance existed together. He could lead without appearing stiff, hold a partner close without losing refinement, and make a small gesture feel more intimate than a grand declaration. The same skills that once made him successful with women in New York ballrooms now became extraordinarily powerful on film. Then there was the way he looked. His dark hair, expressive eyes, carefully tailored clothes, and Mediterranean features distinguished him from the more conventional American leading men around him. Hollywood turned that difference into the image of the Latin lover, but appearance alone does not explain why the fascination survived. Away from the screen, Valentino was also described as sensitive and interested in poetry, literature, art, and beauty. That image complicated the fantasy further. The man playing passionate lovers was not presented merely as a handsome body. He seemed to possess an inner life. And perhaps most importantly, audiences could never completely reach him. The less the public knew about the private Valentino, the more space there was to imagine him. He could become whatever a woman watching from the darkness wanted him to be: dangerous without truly threatening her, strong without being emotionally closed, romantic without seeming ordinary. By the time the Sheik had made him an international sensation, women were crowding his appearances and fan magazines were feeding an appetite that seemed almost impossible to satisfy. Valentino was becoming one of the first male stars to experience the kind of mass romantic devotion that later generations would associate with singers like Frank Sinatra or Elvis Presley. Yet there was another side to this phenomenon. Not everyone looking at Rudolph Valentino saw what those women saw. While female audiences celebrated his elegance, sensitivity, clothes, dancing, and foreign mystique, some men saw those same qualities and reached an entirely different conclusion. The more women wanted Valentino, the more certain critics began asking whether the man they desired was a real man at all. The more women adored Rudolph Valentino, the more uncomfortable some American men seemed to become. By the early 1920s, his popularity had grown beyond ordinary movie stardom. Women crowded theaters, collected his photographs, followed stories about his private life, and sometimes surged toward him at public appearances, simply hoping to touch the man they had watched on screen. But Valentino represented something unfamiliar in American masculinity. He was foreign-born. He moved with the grace of a professional dancer. He cared about clothes and wore them with obvious pleasure. He was associated with perfume, silk shirts, jewelry, carefully styled hair, and a wristwatch at a time when some traditional-minded men still regarded such things as too feminine. He even wore an ornate bracelet given to him by Natasha Rambova, a piece of jewelry that became another target for ridicule. None of these things prevented women from seeing him as intensely masculine. If anything, they seemed to add to his appeal. But that was precisely what made the reaction from some male critics so revealing. Valentino did not fit the rough, restrained, unmistakably American image of manhood they understood. Worse, women appeared to prefer him anyway. One photoplay writer joked that all men hated Valentino because all the women were dizzy over him. Beneath the humor was something more serious. Newspapers and commentators increasingly attacked not merely his acting, but his masculinity itself. His history as a taxi dancer was used against him. His clothes were mocked. His foreign background became part of the caricature. Rumors questioning his sexuality circulated despite the absence of firm evidence supporting them. Valentino sometimes tried to dismiss the hostility as jealousy, but the attacks clearly reached him. By 1926, they had become difficult to ignore. That July, while he was promoting Son of the Sheik, an unsigned Chicago Tribune editorial appeared under the title Pink Powder Puffs. The article used a powder dispenser discovered in a men's washroom as an excuse to complain that American men were becoming feminized, and somehow Valentino became the symbol of everything the writer believed had gone wrong. The piece mocked his appearance, his Italian heritage, and his manhood. This time Valentino did not laugh. He answered publicly, accusing the anonymous writer of insulting both his ancestry and his masculinity, then challenged him to settle the matter in a boxing ring. The writer never accepted, but Valentino was not finished. In New York, he took part in a boxing exhibition before members of the press, sparring with sports writer Frank "Buck" O'Neill, while heavyweight champion Jack Dempsey served as referee. Valentino reportedly landed a punch strong enough to send O'Neill to the floor, and the resulting headlines gave him what he wanted: proof, at least for a day, that Hollywood's elegant lover could throw a fist. Yet beneath the spectacle was something unexpectedly sad. The most desired man in American movies was allowing strangers to define a question he apparently could not dismiss. Was he man enough? He had already conquered Hollywood. Millions of women had answered that question in their own way every time they bought a ticket to see him. Still, Valentino stepped into a boxing ring to answer men who had mocked his clothes and his manner. And the insult would remain with him far longer than anyone could have expected. Within weeks, he would be lying in a New York hospital, gravely ill, and according to one of the most haunting stories told about his final days, the pink powder puff taunt was still on his mind. But before that final chapter, there was another wound far more private. The man who could fight a newspaper could do nothing to stop the woman he loved from walking away. The woman Rudolph Valentino seemed to love most deeply was not one of the millions who worshipped him from a theater seat. She was Natasha Rambova, a costume and set designer whose intelligence, independence, and unconventional interests made her very different from the women Hollywood usually placed beside him on screen. They met while working together in the early 1920s, just as Valentino was becoming one of the most recognizable men in America. Rambova entered his life at a moment when everyone seemed to want a piece of him, and their relationship quickly became intense. She shared his interest in art, beauty, and a world beyond ordinary Hollywood glamour. She was also fascinated by spiritualism and the occult, interests Valentino himself would increasingly explore. Even the ornate bracelet he wore, later mocked by critics as another sign that he was somehow insufficiently masculine, was associated with Rambova. But from the beginning, their love carried complications. Valentino's divorce from Jean Acker was not yet legally far enough behind him when he and Rambova traveled to Mexico and married in May 1922. When they returned to California, Valentino was arrested on a charge of bigamy. For a man whose public image was already built around romance, the spectacle was irresistible to the newspapers. He insisted that Rambova was his wife, but the couple was forced to wait until the legal obstacle had passed. On March 14, 1923, they married again, this time legally. For a while, it may have seemed that Valentino had finally found what his screen characters always promised, a great love worth fighting for. Yet marriage revealed differences that passion could not erase. Rambova was not content simply to stand beside a famous husband. She became deeply involved in his professional life, advising him on scripts, costumes, production choices, and the direction of his career. Valentino respected her artistic instincts, but her influence increasingly brought tension with studios and people around him. Some blamed her when his films failed to match the enormous success of The Sheik, whether fairly or not. At home, another difference was harder to solve. Valentino appears to have wanted a more traditional marriage and eventually a family. Rambova valued her independence and had ambitions of her own. The qualities that had first made her fascinating to him also made her unwilling to disappear into the role of Rudolph Valentino's wife. By 1925, the marriage was collapsing. Rambova left, and the separation wounded him deeply. The irony was almost impossible to miss. Women he had never met wrote to him, dreamed about him, and treated his image as the definition of romance. Yet the woman whose presence mattered most could not remain beside him. One contemporary description captured the contradiction with painful simplicity. The great lover was loved by everyone except, it seemed, his own loves. After Rambova came actress Pola Negri, another glamorous and dramatic figure who became publicly associated with Valentino during the final period of his life. Their relationship generated headlines, and after his death she would claim that they had intended to marry. How firmly Valentino himself shared those plans remains less certain. That uncertainty only adds another layer to his story. The public could always imagine the perfect romance around Rudolph Valentino. His private relationships were far less perfect. By the summer of 1926, he was divorced again, surrounded by rumors, and still the most famous romantic figure of his generation. His newest film, Son of the Sheik, promised to restore him fully to the kind of role audiences loved. Professionally, another beginning seemed possible. Personally, perhaps one was possible too. At 31, Valentino still had time to marry again, to have children, to discover whether lasting love had simply arrived late. He could not know that there would be no late chapter. In August, while promoting the film in New York, the man who had survived scandal, rejection, two broken marriages, and years of public ridicule suddenly felt a pain in his abdomen that he could no longer ignore. By the summer of 1926, Rudolph Valentino appeared to be entering another promising chapter. Son of the Sheikh was returning him to the kind of romantic role audiences had always loved. And at 31, he was still young enough to believe that the disappointments behind him were only part of the journey. But the public battle over his masculinity had followed him into those final weeks. The pink powder puffs insult had angered him enough to challenge its anonymous author to a boxing match. And when that challenge went unanswered, Valentino stepped into an exhibition bout in New York and showed the press that the elegant screen lover could throw a punch. It should have ended there. Instead, the question of whether he was man enough seems to have remained painfully close to him. Then in the middle of August, the argument suddenly became meaningless. Valentino was in New York promoting Son of the Sheikh when severe abdominal pain became impossible to ignore. On August 16th, he was taken to the hospital. Doctors initially suspected appendicitis, but surgery revealed a more complicated abdominal emergency involving a perforated ulcer. The operation appeared successful, and for a brief period, there was reason for hope. Newspapers followed his condition closely, while admirers gathered outside waiting for updates. Valentino himself apparently believed he would recover. According to accounts repeated after his death, even from his hospital bed he remained aware of the controversy that had followed him there. In one of the most haunting lines attributed to his final days, he reportedly asked a doctor, "Did I behave like a pink powder puff or like a man?" Whether every word was remembered exactly is difficult to know, but the story endured because it captured something painfully revealing. Here was a man adored by millions of women, lying seriously ill and still thinking about strangers who had questioned his manhood. For a time, his condition improved. He spoke with friends and looked toward the future. There were films still to make, a career that seemed to be recovering, and an entire life that should have remained ahead of him. Then complications set in. Infection spread through his body, and peritonitis weakened him further. His condition deteriorated as the days passed. On the morning of August 23rd, Valentino reportedly regained consciousness for a short time. He spoke to those around him and still seemed connected to plans beyond the hospital room. But his strength was disappearing. He slipped into a coma, and shortly after noon, Rudolph Valentino died. He was only 31 years old. The timing made the loss feel even more cruel. He had survived poverty, scandal, an arrest that went nowhere, a disastrous first marriage, a bigamy charge, professional battles, two broken marriages, and years of ridicule. He had fought his way from 10-cent dances in New York to become one of the most recognizable men on earth. And just as Son of the Sheikh seemed ready to remind audiences why they had fallen in love with him, there would be no next film. Valentino would never grow older before the public. He would never face the arrival of talking pictures. No one would discover whether his Italian accent or his voice would strengthen the spell or break it. He would never know whether another marriage, children, or the quiet family life he once seemed to want might still have been waiting for him. At 31, every possibility simply stopped. Yet outside the hospital, another story was only beginning. When the news reached the streets that Rudolph Valentino was dead, the private tragedy of one young man became public grief on a scale Hollywood had scarcely seen before. The women who had spent years dreaming about him now had only one final chance to get close to him, and tens of thousands would come. The news of Rudolph Valentino's death did not remain inside the hospital for long. On August 23rd, 1926, it moved through New York and then across America, turning the death of a 31-year-old actor into something that looked almost like national mourning. Outside Campbell's funeral church in Manhattan, enormous crowds gathered for a final glimpse of the man they had known only through flickering images on a silent screen. Contemporary accounts describe tens of thousands of mourners, with some estimates suggesting that as many as 100,000 people attempted to pass through during the viewing period. The lines stretched for blocks. People pushed forward. Windows were broken in the crush. Police struggled to control the streets, and mounted officers were called in as grief became almost impossible to contain. Women cried openly. Some fainted. Newspapers also carried sensational reports of suicides connected to Valentino's death, although several of those stories were never firmly verified. Yet no exaggeration was needed to understand what had happened. America had lost a movie star, but many of the people outside that funeral home behaved as though they had lost someone personally. Then came Paula Negri. Dressed dramatically in black, she appeared at the funeral home and expressed her grief before the cameras and reporters. She claimed that she and Valentino had planned to marry, although how firmly he had shared those plans remains uncertain. Even in death, the boundary between Valentino's private life and the fantasy surrounding him was difficult to separate. His body was eventually carried west by train, and people gathered along the route as though saying goodbye to someone who belonged not simply to Hollywood, but to them. In California, he was laid to rest at what is now Hollywood Forever Cemetery. But death did something unusual to Rudolph Valentino. It ended his life while preserving his image. He would never grow old in front of an audience. He would never face the microphone and discover whether his voice could survive the transition from silent pictures to talkies. He would never watch another generation of leading men replace him. Instead, he remained 31. Dark-haired, elegant, mysterious, forever captured in the moment before time could change him. The rituals of remembrance continued. Stories emerged of a mysterious lady in black who visited his crypt with flowers. And over the decades, other admirers followed. Roses appeared. Lipstick kisses were left on the marble. Generations born long after Valentino died discovered the sheik or son of the sheik and found themselves asking the same question women had asked in the 1920s. What was it about this man? Perhaps the answer was never simply beauty. Hollywood had beautiful men before him and would have many after him. Valentino offered something less easily defined. He could appear strong without hiding tenderness, sensual without needing words, elegant without apologizing for it, and vulnerable without completely surrendering the mystery around him. Women saw romance in those contradictions. Some men saw a threat. Valentino himself may never have fully understood why either reaction became so intense. And perhaps that is the final irony of his story. Hollywood sold Rudolph Valentino as the perfect lover, yet his own romantic life brought rejection, scandal, 2 failed marriages, and unanswered questions. Millions of women imagined what it might be like to be loved by him, while he spent much of his short adult life searching for a love that would remain. Death ensured that search would never have an ending. There would be no older Valentino, no quiet family photographs, no children to tell us who their father became after fame, and no final interview in which he could look back and explain the man behind the image. Nearly a century later, we are left with the same beautiful, silent face. Maybe that is why Rudolph Valentino has never entirely disappeared. He was gone before the world could finish imagining him, and somewhere in the darkness of an old theater, he is still young, still silent, still moving toward the woman on the screen, and still leaving us to wonder who the real man was when the cameras stopped.